as we're getting started with the second ever Bit Lounge podcast, I think I'm going to give it I think you've got the topic idea of today, or is Logan?
Yeah,
Logan got any clue of what
I don't
images?
think he has any clue on these. These are just kind of more theory crafted and not necessarily more of the sense of just direct questions. It's kind of more
good.
I think today I'm going to be scrambling to pull up sources and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, if you find something over a little topic, feel free to just kind of bop in with a graph or question you have, or just kind of anything you got.
Well, I'll turn it over to you. What do you got in store for me today?
So yesterday's podcast, we kind of talked about people's kind of opinion on, or the question of, some people think that Bitcoin is going to go to zero. And there's like one of the biggest problems that we had, or that people have. And
is there fear of Bitcoin going to zero, right? Yeah, it's what's stopping them from purchasing Bitcoin or learning about it because they think it's magic internet money or something like that. They don't understand it, right?
Magic internet.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny. Last night when I went to dinner with my family, my mom was asking me the same question. She's like, "Is it going to go to zero?"
Yeah, that's everyone. So, what's funny about that is because we aren't taught about money, that our only experience is actual U.S. dollars, right? So we just have a really biased opinion when you grow up in a system, and your generation's the last generation that'll probably ever touch physical cash, right? And so anyone older has experience with cash, but when you become my age, that was like the dominant experience was cash, right? And my grandfather, your great-grandfather, right, he walked around in his wallet, and it was a huge wallet, and it was cash because he didn't trust the banks at all, right? So he was, out of the Depression, so he understood what a bank failure was. And his generation, and I would say even your great-great-grandfather, they really didn't trust the banks because they went through the Depression. They understood what that was, and they saw them actually physically lose money through banks, right? And the banking crisis of 2008 padded people from physically losing their money, but even at that point, it was still digital, right? Mm-hmm. So your question about it going to zero.
So going kind of through the rabbit hole of like what money is, 1971 coming off the gold standard, I think the idea of what money is kind of changed a little bit. But the premise of just what money is, I feel like has still stayed the same, of kind of exchanging something to buy something.
Yeah. Money. Someone's grasp of money hasn't really changed. If you're older, right?
Yeah.
But a younger person experiences money differently than an older person.
And I think, growing up in today's world at my age, I think people are mostly, especially with social media, trained to think and react quicker than think about the future. Mm-hmm. And I think being like my
instant
age, instant gratification, dopamine, just to the brain, everything. Yeah. And so I kind of see as like when you get paid or something, you're worried about the next week, tomorrow. I'm not necessarily.
So what you're saying is you don't want to put your money in something that, because you experience it digitally, that would go to zero in your bank account. Because I think in your generation of video games, and as a gamer myself, you understand like that, the digital aspect of it. And I think when people hear a digital money and placing value into something that they don't understand what it is, that balance could go to zero.
Yeah.
Right.
And two, I think also we're trained to react and have emotions so much quicker that I think that most people are fixed on, is it going to change tomorrow, today, right, and not necessarily looking at it in the 5-10 year grand things of.
So I agree that it's a generational thing, that if I have my grandfather has a wallet full of cash, there's zero fear that the cash is going to zero, right? That they might fear that the bank might close and they might lose it, or they might get robbed and they might lose it. But the cash itself, there wasn't really a fear of the value of that going to zero, that the dollars in his pocket, because they didn't experience inflation like we are right now. Like the 70s, you know, they were well aware of what that was then, but you start talking about in the 50s and 40s and stuff like that, we didn't have inflation like we did in the 70s, and now we're experiencing this inflation boom, you know, that we had over the last couple of years, and may actually still be in front of us to some degree. So that fear of zero in physical cash that you would hold in your wallet or something like that, I could see that older people adopting a digital thing, they think the digital thing has an opportunity to go to zero.
Yeah. And so talking about something like Bitcoin, one of the ways it's kind of like helped me at my age is kind of thinking of it like Social Security is to, you put your dollars in, or your dollars, and you convert it to Bitcoin, but you're not touching it. Yeah. And if you are touch it, there is a penalty. You lost money to your future self.
Oh, that's a good point.
And so that's how I kind of view it, to help me not want to touch it, not want to look at it, the price every day.
Yeah, to
understand, touch it and leave it.
Yeah, so what you're touching on there is like a bedrock of Bitcoin as a store of value. And so the fear of it going to zero, what you started with, right, is the confidence that it is not going to lose value that that gave it value. So the only thing that really gives the U.S. dollar value is that we, as a society, right, agree that it has value. Yeah. Because it's not, like you mentioned, 1971, we came off the gold standard, right?
Or like you've said, because I've said so money.
Yeah, that's what what fiat is just Latin for because I said so, right? So what backs it is a military, but really it's ingrained into the society that it has value, that it is the world reserve currency, that it's, you know, it's the thing that you trade other currencies to, right? But we have a bias in the United States that because we were born in the country that has the world reserve currency, we aren't wanting to trade Zimbabwe dollars, right, to get out of Zimbabwe dollars into the world reserve currency. So it's weird that for a citizen in the United States to go, well, I'm going to trade my currency that I hold for this other thing, right? We haven't had that, but I think foreigners have a easier time understanding the value of Bitcoin because they're worried about their currency losing value and getting out of their currency into the dollar. Whereas in the United States, we don't have that. So, you know, like you were saying, Logan, like having that conversation with your parents and they're like, oh yeah, they have never had a need to get out of their currency into something else. So that's where I think that fear of it going to zero, that the world doesn't agree.
Yeah, I can see that. The world doesn't necessarily agree with how we operate versus everyone else operates is a little bit different.
Having the world reserve currency in the United States makes us biased because we use the dollar every single day.
Yes,
right?
I agree.
And we're citizens. And every other country trades for the dollar, right?
Yeah.
Or is measuring their worth to the dollar, right? But as a Bitcoiner, someone that's adopted Bitcoin, the fundamental thing that you understand is I kind of, you know, because we are Americans and understand Santa Claus, right? In my mind, Santa Claus is at the North Pole and there's actually like a pole at the North Pole that looks like a candy cane, right? So if you were just to paint that image of the North Pole actually being a physical pole, like a candy cane up there, right? And if you were to take that little candy cane and you could draw a black mark on it and put the price of Bitcoin, right? The world has never really seen anything other than the US dollar that you could measure other currencies against, right? The dollar didn't have to compete against anything else. So when we look at the price of Bitcoin, right now, I think it's, 94,000 ish, 95. I mean,
Changes.
it could be, 100,000 in an hour. But so if you were to take that mark and you put it up there, we can now measure the price of the dollar against Bitcoin. But every other currency can measure their currency against Bitcoin too. And the amount of Bitcoin, if you pull it up in like Canadian dollars, if you said Bitcoin in Canadian dollars, it's going to be over 100,000. Yeah, look at that. So yeah, 100. So look, if you're in Canada, this is what you see, right? But we don't look at it as United States citizens in Canadian dollars because we don't buy anything in Canadian dollars, right? But they're going, wait a minute, if I have to buy Bitcoin, I have to pay $137. Well, they're already doing that currency exchange. I'm not going to go into dollars and then dollars into Bitcoin right there. The whole world gets to measure against Bitcoin right now, right? There is a different reserve that you could store wealth in. In fact, if you were to store wealth in cash, that'd be like the worst decision in the world to make, is to store your wealth in cash, because it's losing 7 to 10% of its value every single year, right? Yeah. And so that fear of zero of that person coming in is really just from a bias. It's a mental bias of growing up in a system that trained you on the dollar. You are biased because it is the world reserve currency. So you've never had to leave the dollar to go to anything else, right? And so that's where that fear of going to zero creeps in. It's like, oh, it's digital. I hear all these weird things about, other coins going to zero and stuff like that. And so there's a learning curve to get over, Bitcoin versus every other thing that would, be called a shit coin. And that would be a topic for another thing. But but going back to your measured or your fear of it going to zero, the funny thing is as Bitcoiners, the technology, the reason that it has value, but Bitcoin is a global asset.
Yeah. And kind of leading into that. So if Bitcoin isn't going to zero, where do you think it's going to go in the next 10 to 15 years instead of a short term 0 to 5 or 5 to 10? Where do you think you'll be, and what Bitcoin and the idea it's became in 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because if it's not going to zero, right, then it's going up forever. Okay, so let me explain what that means. Is the value of the dollar, we all agree, the dollar can buy this much, but the value of the dollar is controlled by how many dollars are in the system. And every year they print 7 to 10% more dollars into the system, right? So if I'm a seller of goods and they dilute me in the market, I have to raise my price, right? So that I can stay up with the dilution. Well, if I raise my price as the seller, you as the buyer now have to pay more. Mm-hmm. How do you acquire that dollar as the buyer? Work, right? You have to go out and work, right?
Birthday.
Yeah, as a young person, birthdays and Christmas, work. But as the buyer of goods, you have to go out and work, okay? And then for you to work, someone needs to pay you. So you need to produce value, right? But if I tell you that you need next year to produce 7% more value, okay? How do you do that? What's your constraint as an individual?
Time.
Right, time, right? So let's say the 40-hour work week. Well, if you need to make 7% more and you still want to work 40 hours, but you need 7% more, that the only outlet is for you to get 7% more money from who?
to your boss.
Right,
Raise of
exactly. A
7%.
raise, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But if I'm the maker of goods and my employer or my employees want 7% more, well, don't I have to raise my prices now? Right? So now I have to raise my prices because my employees need more money. Right? But aren't I also the one now causing the inflation to go up because I raised my prices, right?
Yeah.
So, but what you see is the lag effect. So what happens is I inject more money into the system, okay? Well, as I print that more money, then I can't buy as much. Well, then you figure it out, which takes some amount of time to figure out, well, I'm not buying as much. And then you have to go in and ask your boss for a raise, and your boss has to eventually, so there's this lag effect. So if we're constantly printing money, then you're constantly needing more money to go out and buy the same amount of goods, because most likely you're unwilling to add 7% more time into your work week if you're a salaried employer, right? You're like, okay, well, I don't know what's 7% more in time in a week. Logan, you could probably do the math on that, but let's say it's the 40-hour work week at 10% would be 4 hours more. So it'd be like 3 hours, right? So you would go from a 40-hour work week to a 43-hour work week.
About 42.8.
Yeah. But what I want to show you, though, is how out of hand. This is where people stop this experiment, is they would go 7%. What was that, 2.8?
2.8, yep.
2.8, okay. So the first year, let's say we weren't going to raise prices, and we just put it all on the employee and said, hey, you're going to have to work 2.8 more hours so this week, right, for the year, right, to keep up with that. And then next year, well, it's 7% of 42.8. It's not 40 anymore.
Yeah.
Right? So now it's 7% of 42.8. So now you're going to have to go basically, what is that? Right at 3%, 3 more hours. Okay. So the year after that, now you're working 45.8.
So you're saying it becomes this
right?
exponential curve.
It's exponentially, right? So the year after that, well, you physically can't do that, right? You're constrained by time, but you're constrained by the amount of effort and energy that you as a human can produce. So the only way is to raise prices. I can't burden you as the employee to a point because if you extrapolate that out for 100 years, well, there's not enough time in the week, right? Yeah. You actually have to sleep and you have to, do other things, right? So that gets you kind of back to the source of the problem, though, is the invention of the 40-hour work week, right? So we didn't always work 40. That wasn't like the standard, right? So there was a standard of the creation of the 40-hour work week, right? And that was actually invented by Ford in the Model T. And we'll go into the history of that at some other point. We'll go down that rabbit hole. But what you're constrained by is the physical labor that you can produce and the value that you demand for that labor, right? Mm-hmm. So if I print more money and I dilute everyone, the effect is that as the employee, you have a lifestyle that you want to maintain in America, right? And as Americans, we basically have this ethos. It's called the American dream.
White picket fence, family, 2 kids, 2 cars.
Yeah, house, right? That's the American dream. So as Americans, we set this bar. We said, okay, that's what we should be able to measure it by, right? And how do we achieve that, right? And so now when you start diluting to achieve that thing that we said is the goal as American, right?
Yeah.
How do you achieve it, right?
Changing the dream.
So you're going to work harder to go do that?
Yeah.
Well, wait a minute. No, you're going to demand more money to achieve that, right? So if you start falling behind in being able to achieve that, that's what you see right now is the unrest that you see is people going, wait a minute, and we'll get back. This would be a great time to throw it out, right? So I have this philosophy of why it's called the American dream, right? My thing is, if we were on a Bitcoin standard and we were backed by money, real money, it would be called the American goal, okay? Because goals are meant to be achieved. Dreams are something that you chase. And I think it was intentional that it was called the American dream at the time that it was created, because it was never meant to be achieved.
That's interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? But if you become a Bitcoiner and you understand the fundamentals of Bitcoin, and you understand, in the last show we mentioned kind of what was the median, do you remember what we said the median price of the house was 4 years ago? It was like,
Yeah,
320.
320.
320.
420.
Now it's 420. So in 4 years, that's the effect of the inflation. It's the same house,
Yeah.
right? It's the median price house. So let's make it real personal to someone out there. Let's say 4 years ago, you bought the median price house, okay? And you live in that house. And now it's worth $420,000. And you, as a buyer, want to buy that house from that person, okay? They feel $100,000 wealthier, right?
Yeah.
Okay, because they're selling the house to you,
Yeah.
right? So you give them $420,000, and they have $420,000 now in their pocket. But guess what? They have to go buy the median house price again, right?
So yeah, you didn't gain anything really.
You didn't gain anything, right? You lost in that scenario, because every amount of that 100,000 that you have has to go back into the exact same. Now, you might have got a different neighborhood, a different paint color, or something like that. But if we're comparing median price house to median price house, right?
Not saying like you're downsizing or anything. Yeah.
If you're living in that house, you felt wealthier. That's the illusion, right? You feel wealthier, right? But remember what we said as a Bitcoiner, though. How much Bitcoin 4 years ago was it?
It's like 35. 35, yeah.
Yeah, 35 Bitcoin, right? And now, if you take 420 at the current price, that's just for easy math. Say Bitcoin's 100,000, so I can do this real easily, right? So that's 4.2 Bitcoin, right? So if I stored my value in Bitcoin, I would need only 4.2 Bitcoin right now to afford the house, because the value of Bitcoin, right? Versus 35 Bitcoin then. The price of the house for me as a Bitcoiner got cheaper.
That's real interesting.
Okay. That's the difference between Bitcoin and cash. Cash is an inflationary money. Okay. That's not really a money. Just call it a currency. Okay. It's a very poor money because it's not a store of value. And Bitcoin is a store of value, which is a hard money. It's a fixed cap, 21 million supply, but it's a deflationary technology, right? So the effect of that deflationary technology, people are used to seeing it in TVs, right? Monitors, right? Everyone goes out and they're like, Super Bowl Sunday, what do they go out and buy?
TV.
Yeah, the 4K, 8K TV, right? So if you see it, if you see the big flat screen go from, a few years ago, everyone was getting a 1080p. Then the 4K came out. Heck, we were at Best Buy there. They have
8K now.
Yeah, we have 8K TVs right now, right? And then you said when we were looking at it, oh man, those things must be outrageous. No, they were like $5,000 for a 80-something inch,
Yeah, because
TV.
The 4K when that came out, it was like $10,000 for.
So in technology, people are used to technology being deflationary, right? Going from like a 1080p TV now, $500. I mean, maybe less than that.
You could go to Walmart for a TV that's 4K. That's $200. I bought one for my dorm.
yeah, $200. So people are used to technology being deflationary, right? A graphics card in your computer, right? Every year, until recently, don't get me into the NVIDIA things, right? So graphics card got significantly more powerful, but they used to also get cheaper. Now they get more expensive because it's, one giant company dominating everything.
Yeah.
So take that out. But people were used to, computers getting faster and faster and cheaper, right? We've kind of plateaued. Your generation didn't see the improvement that I saw. Like Moore's Law was, every couple years you're getting twice the computer, and it was getting cheaper. So if it was getting twice as fast, shouldn't you be twice as much money? Or you would expect that, right?
Yeah.
But it was getting cheaper. So you're getting more performance for less money, right? People are used to technology being deflationary. They're not used to money being deflationary. And what most people don't, this is a really strong point, is that people aren't used to the default state of the economy. And what I mean by that is any economy that produces technology is deflationary by nature. Like it should naturally in this country, what's the biggest companies out there? NVIDIA and Apple, Google, and all those, right? Aren't we getting more and more productive every single year from these? Like when I was first developing and building homes, I mean, we barely had the cell phone. You know how much more productive I am because I have a cell phone right now, right? Of all the amount of stuff that I can do now versus, your grandmother, she would stop at a payphone to, she'd have to go get like a roll of quarters to make her calls for the day and get a specific time of day to go make phone calls and receive phone calls remotely. Like a cell phone is allowing us to do tremendously more effort. You can build more houses. You can be more productive, right? So if you're more productive and more efficient, things should be getting cheaper, right? That is the default state of a country that has technology.
So do you think our generation or this new upcoming generation, would you say that they don't work as hard, or do you think that they became more productive than previous generations? It's kind of a loaded question.
Yeah. So what's happening is what you're seeing is the effect of an economy on people and the manipulation of the economy. And I won't go, next week, we're going to really take a deep dive into like the history and stuff of that. So tune in next week. But you're measuring your experience of going through it, and you don't have, because you're younger, you don't have all these generations of time, decades of time to see what has happened. But what's your experience right there is a manipulation of a currency and its effect on you. So if the default state is deflationary and every year it's getting cheaper, why is it, you have to ask the question, why is it getting more expensive then, right? So what's being covered up? So let's say the Apple iPhone, don't you think the iPhone 1 versus the iPhone 16, the iPhone 16 is way more productive. There's way more apps, right? I mean, iPhone 1, when it came out, I mean, there might have been like 5 apps in the App Store. I mean, it had an App Store. That was what was amazing, right? I mean, I don't know if you have any idea. I have zero idea how many apps are in the App Store, but it's thousands, maybe tens of thousands. I have no idea. It's a lot, right? Tens of thousands of how many apps in the App Store? Oh my gosh.
1.9 million.
1.9 million apps in the App Store. Okay. Wow. Now, think about that for a second. The amount of jobs that technology created, right? Those are all tech jobs, right? To create like one app is not one person, right? Those are teams of people and so this device created all this productivity, right? So if there's all this productivity getting created, why do we still experience prices going up? The answer is the printing of money is overcompensating for something that is naturally deflationary. So when they come on and they tell you that the consumer price index, it's called the CPI, right? That's what they measure inflation with. It's this government number that they take a basket of goods and they measure it from one year to the next, and they say, hey, we're trying to get inflation down to 2%, and right now it's like 2.8, 2.9, right? And their target is 2. We'll have to get into that conversation. But basically, I call that the CP lie. It's not the CPI, right? It's hiding the effect. And notice the words here, consumer price index. Okay, who's that for? Consumers, right? In this basket of goods, there's no assets in the baskets because they don't expect consumers to own assets, right?
Yeah.
In this basket of goods is food and energy and things like that. And they actually manipulate the number for housing in there. So it's why I call it the consumer price lie is, we mentioned this earlier, what's the ethos of the United States? That white picket fence, right?
Yeah,
Right? What's that? The American dream, right? Well, if the United States has an ethos of this thing called the American dream, what is the primary thing of that American dream? The house.
Yeah, to get it.
Well, no, the house, right?
Yeah,
I phrased it wrong. Like, so, the wife, 2 kids, the car, the white picket fence, the house. The house is like that staple thing that if you were to say the American dream, right, that people are chasing.
Yeah, it's a home to go to.
Right, home,
It's a place.
Right? It is the thing to strive for, right? So if you were to measure inflation, right, and publish a number to your citizenry, okay, to measure inflation, wouldn't you include the price of a house?
I would.
Right? The normal person would, right? That would be the metric if that's going to be your ethos and say, hey, guess what? Well, the number that they use to measure inflation in housing, and this is something as a developer that has frustrated me for years, is it's basically an opinion asked of people that rent, okay? But it's not the renters, it's the landlords, and it's a specific target group. So in an age where we have like Zillow and Redfin, like we have computers that could go out there and tell you the price of your neighbor's house, right? Don't you think we have the technology to grab every price of every house that was sold that month?
Yeah.
Pretty easily, right? Didn't we invent all this technology as a country and we can't grasp the number of so you got to ask yourself, well, why is the primary expense to an American citizen the largest expense? Housing, right? The number one thing. Why is that not measured accurately, right? That's why I call it the CP lie. Because if you were to measure it accurately, you would have to show that number is not 2.8, 2.9. It's closer to 7 to 10% every year, right? And so if I were to tell you that, I might incite mass panic, right? So I, as the creator of the number, am incentivized to keep that number low, right? And so in this CPI basket of goods, I, as the government, am able to substitute things. And what you'll see is if you were to look at the way they measured CPI in the 1950s versus today, right? Well, there would be this basket of goods, and one of those would be like entertainment, okay? And so entertainment back, if you pulled CPI back then or CPI back then, they would say, okay, what would it cost to go out to the movies, right? You could
movies now, used to as a student could get it like $12.45.
Yeah,
for,
okay.
For one ticket.
Okay, so my grandfather would go out there and pay a nickel to go to a movie, right? Okay, now it's
$12, $15, I think would be.
Right. A quarter was like a Saturday afternoon, like to go in there and say, hey, I want to go, spend the afternoon at the movies, get some popcorn and all that. And you could pull that off on a quarter, right? So one individual movie for 5 cents, though. The lie is that when they measure that today, will they say, well, we're not going to use the price of a movie ticket. Well, isn't Netflix a lot cheaper than going to a movie for $10 a month, you can get access to all these movies, right?
Shoot,
So-
on Amazon, when a movie comes out, it's $20 now to rent it. But if you take median home, which is 4 people,
yeah.
I mean, split that up by 4. I mean,
Yeah. So the individual entertainment category though got manipulated is the point, right? It's not, you're not measuring apples for apples. You're substituting an apple for an orange that's flavored like an apple, right? It's not the same thing. And the reason they do that is to minimize that number so that not to incite mass panic, right? Okay. So to get to that point back there of that deflationary thing. So how do you hide that number, right? Well, if you're printing more money in and you're manipulating the number, the real answer is it's costing you most likely more than the 7 to 10%, but that number is so hard and so specific to you individually that you can't measure it. Okay. Yeah. So the 7 to 10% is like a good way to say this is the real number.
Yeah. So every year it's getting harder and harder to basically even attain anywhere close to the American dream. And so, I mean,
chase the American
dream. Chase the American dream.
Yeah, chase the American
Not
dream.
Not even
right?
the goal of actually doing it. So,
well, here's my question to you. Just in Logan, I'm going to pose this question to both you guys because this is a generational thing. So when I was growing up and newly married and all that, you know, young in life, I thought I was chasing the American dream because in my mind it was attainable. At your age, a $420,000 house, 2 cars, a wife and 2 kids that have to go to college, on the salary that you would get coming out of college, do you feel like that's even attainable?
Not at all. No,
not even because I think I saw something to like raise 1 kid in the housing now. It's like from 0 to 18, it was like $250 per kid.
Yeah, and that's if they don't go to college. Okay.
That's just 0 to 18.
That's 0
like
to that's
saying that
they're gone at 18. It's up to you at 18, right?
Yeah.
If you want to contribute to college, I mean, this is millions of dollars, right, to raise a kid.
I mean, shit, especially if you say a private college.
Yeah, a private college, right? So when asking 2 young people coming out, entering the workforce,
now you're coming out of school with a loan of a house just
right.
for student loans.
Exactly. Right. Your student loan house, right? That's what it is. It's like
can't drive it, can't live in it. It's just a number on a
And
so a big number and you still have nowhere to live.
Yeah. And so you're experiencing this gap, right? That it didn't keep up, right? The dilution of the dollar, my generation to your generation, mine, it felt attainable, right? Yeah. And you like, is there any hope? Like if you were to literally calculate what that cost is, how would you even think about that? Okay, you got 2 kids that are going to cost you millions of dollars, right?
What's the median salary of a job right now?
Coming out of college.
My
guess would be like 70 to 90. I would say 7.
I think 90, just the median job of just America is like 50,000 or something.
Right, but a college graduate,
I want to say like 60, 70.
Yeah, I'm going to say 60 to 70, right? So that's 75,000 is what came up there as a good salary for a college. Okay, so that's a great generational thing, right? So let's say you're making 75,000, okay, and take home pay. Pull up a calculator, Logan, and give us this number. Take minus 25% in taxes for take home pay, okay. So 75,000 times 0.75. Okay, so now your net. This is your net. Okay, this is what you have to live on, right? Okay, now the down payment on that median house, $420,000, is 20%.
Yeah.
Right? So what's 20%, Logan, of 420,000? It's going to be 84,000, right? 84,000?
Somewhere in that ballpark.
Okay. So the $84,000 down payment that you have to come up with. Okay.
Yeah.
And you have a total of $56,000 to live on yourself, right? Okay. So in my day, when you grew up, when I grew up, the number one rule was, go to school, get a good job, and save 10% of your income so that you could afford the American dream. 10% of $56,000 is $5,600. How many years do you have to save 10% of your income?
Well, part of my language, but I'm screwed.
You're screwed, right?
Yeah, I'm screwed.
So in 10 years, you've got 50. You don't even have enough. So 15 years, right? Now, what is the price of that house going to do in 15 years, right? In 4 years, we saw it go $100,000. So, okay, 4 more years, it's growing. It's escaping you at escape velocity. What this is that S curve that I'm talking about. So when it's small numbers, it's that nickel. That's that nickel for the movies, right?
Yeah.
At 7%, when that nickel goes next year, it's 7% more. Well, then 7% of 5 cents is like 6 cents. You don't notice it, right? But when you start getting big numbers that start multiplying by percentages, that's that S curve that starts getting away from you. You're living that S curve right now. That's why you feel like, oh, screw that. But my thing is, though, at what point does it feel like it's not attainable? At what generation do you not even chase it? Do your kids go, that's so comical?
And going back to my original question, 10, 15 years, what do you think that price is? Do you think it's even livable and attainable? Sorry. Right. And so one of the other questions, I don't know if the exact word, but Elon came up with it and said that we're going to have to get rid of it, or currency. We're going to have to adopt what was that word?
A universal income.
A universal income, right?
Universal.
And so, a universal basic income is what we're going. And that's kind of like an AI thing. I think it's almost a guarantee, but by the time that you have, so right now, if you were to say universal basic income to the populace, what they would see is, why do you want to hand out free money to people? And we kind of saw the effect of that in COVID, what that looked like, screwed the economy up, right? So my fear is, by the time that you need it and the time that you can pass it, what you've got is, right now the populace is going to go, you're crazy. We're not going to hand out a bunch of free money to people because it'll screw up the economy. And I would agree. We saw what just handing a few checks to people did.
Yeah,
okay?
I mean,
because we printed the money, right? If you didn't print the money, so we got to, that's what's warping people's mind right now, is they saw checks come, in COVID, they're like, hey, I got a check. And, Donald Trump signed one, Biden signed the other one, right? But where did that money come from? It came from printing the money. If you talk about it differently, not in the assumption that we print the money, so you're diluting everyone, right? Yeah. Those are two different conversations. So if we could find the money, the country's in debt, like $35 trillion. There's no finding the money. The only thing that would happen would be that you would print it. So, but let's just assume for a second that you didn't print it and you could cut government spending and balance the budget and all these, unicorn solutions right now, and literally just hand people legit money, right? That is not diluting every other citizen in the meantime, handing it to them. By the time that you pass that in the public sphere, it would probably, everything had escaped it price-wise so far that it would be like minimum wage right now. What's the minimum wage right now? Like $7 still?
I think in Texas it's $7.25.
Yes, $7.25, right? Okay, how outdated is $7.25?
Right? Yes, $7.25.
Okay, but I'm not an advocate for raising the minimum wage, right? That's a completely different conversation and topic. I by no means am saying raise the minimum wage, but what I'm saying is that number is so outdated that if you paid everyone $7.25, what $7.25 buys you is nothing, right? Definitely doesn't buy you the American dream. And what what we're talking about is not giving everyone the American dream. It's the ability to get on the path to get it. Paying someone $725 does not put you on the path to get the American
need
dream.
3 or 4 jobs.
Right? Yeah, maybe 3 or 4 of those things right there. It does not even put you on the path to obtaining the American dream. What I'm talking about is that it's escaping so fast. There's some psychological effect that I'm curious, like when the reason I asked that question on your generation is because you said you don't feel like it's attainable, right? Do you feel it's still worth chasing?
I think honestly, your perspective kind of has to change, and kind of idea of what you want has changed.
Yeah. So I think you're so
I haven't
young.
heard anyone mention that.
Like your friend group at your age, Logan, Emerson, right now. I don't think y'all sit around and talk about trying to buy a house, right? I think it's so far gone that it's like that's probably not even enter your conversation at this point.
I think the most topic is how to get more money.
Yeah, but like
I think the main thing we talk about is what apartment are we getting?
Yeah, right. Like a house is not even in the conversation.
Yeah, no,
right.
Our buddy is looking at getting a complex or renting out like a townhome in Houston.
Yeah, it's not.
I mean,
it's your generation's. I assume is not sitting there going, here's the difference. I was married at 19. Like a house was attainable. It was a goal, and we attained it, right? Like, but it was actually a topic of conversation. By the time I was your age, I had owned a house, right? It was attainable. I went out and worked and saved, and it was possible to do. What I'm saying is, it's not even in conversation because it's so unattainable, right? But at some point, the next generation, it's not an American dream. It's something they heard about.
Oh, I mean,
it's a history book, right?
Yeah.
You open up the history book and go, one time people used to try and work really hard and get this. What is that? So I love your question about what does that look like in the future, right? So going back to the original thing, if Bitcoin's not going to zero, what's the price going to? Well, remember we said that the house went from 320 to 420, but Bitcoin went from 35 to 4, right? Bitcoin as a deflationary technology, if you can get someone out there to understand and adopt it and do the research and put in the hours of understanding it and actually adopt Bitcoin, it can transform an entire generation of something that is unattainable into a thing that they understand and go, wait a minute, why would I ever give up the most powerful asset in the world to buy the house, right? I could get the house by leveraging the Bitcoin, right? Why give up my Bitcoin for the house and pin my Bitcoin to that fixed price of house when the price of Bitcoin keeps making houses cheaper?
Yeah.
You should hold the Bitcoin, right? So if you can get someone on the other side of that camera lens to understand the power of a deflationary money, a deflationary technology, and what that effect has on your purchasing power, that's my point of changing it to the American goal. If you can become a Bitcoiner, it becomes a goal.
Yeah.
If you stay in fiat, it is a dream. And it's a dream that keeps fading. Right? It gets further and further away. You keep chasing it and chasing it and chasing it. But I'm just worried that your generation and that, the generation after, the kids that you guys have, that they've just heard about it. If we don't change and fix something.
I mean, we're just talking about money right now. I mean, this is a subject for later, but like we were talking about, introducing AI to the mix makes it even everything happen faster, more expensive.
And that's where why personally your question is really, really powerful. And someone, watching this is in disbelief going, this is crazy. They're not even experiencing the effect of AI. And the solution to the problem can exist in AI. So you mentioned earlier that the growth, right? We were talking about the growth and deflationary aspect of the United States measured in technology, TVs and things like that, right? So if you can, there's the only really saving grace, right, is Bitcoin and AI. So if you keep them in parallel and say, this is the money that we could switch to, and the productivity that AI, if you could be so productive that you could out-earn that 7 to 10%. Think about that. Like, you can't increase your work week 40 hours, right? But what if there's an AI tool out there that can make you 10x more productive, right? That you can, in that week, you got 400 hours of work done, right? And you can monetize that, right? Because of AI. Now what's happened is you're using this tool to kind of cheat the system because you're getting paid for the output that you're doing. And that's where AI could change that curve, that even in the dollar system, that if you added AI to it and you got that type of explosion. But the problem with that is that it's not going to be even-handedly distributed, right? There's going to be some people that are able to use the tool and get that type of performance. Yeah. The guy, so let's just think of the guy flipping burgers at the burger joint, right? That tool doesn't affect him the same way as someone on the backside of a computer that's using that AI tool. He's going to have an advantage before. In fact, I'd argue the guy flipping the hamburgers is most likely going to be put out of the job by the guy using the AI tool because he's going to throw that AI into a robot that can flip the hamburgers 24/7 and not, want to take off on Christmas and holidays and stuff like that, right? So you have, when you start extrapolating that out, the real answer to that question is Bitcoin's not going to zero. It's going up forever, but you may need it to go up forever, right? Yeah. Because of the alternative thing. And so we can move that conversation to next week, but that's where this is going. The fear that it goes to zero is an old bias, not preparing for the future, right? And I think what we kind of talked about earlier is like moving this podcast into a thing, really focusing on the future, because your generation is going to experience a future. I'm going to benefit from some of these things now at, 50 years old. In 15 years, sayonara, I'm retired at that point in time, but you guys are fighting some robots for jobs, right? And so your generation in that battle of money and AI, when you ask that question of, can you afford it? Whew, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, man, I think that's a really interesting question to ask, and I think.
So, okay, one more thing before we kind of end it right there. I know we have some really cool stuff planned, next week in the topics and whatnot, but of giving some thought experiments out there. I think that would be a really cool thing to let people know that, as we develop this show, we're going to try to develop it to the point where we increase people's base knowledge of Bitcoin and money, right? But then help them bridge that gap and release those old biases. We all have these internal biases, in that to answer that question, how do I make more money? Right, that we asked in the last episode, is recognizing your own bias, right? And we all grow up and inherently have those biases. And one of them we mentioned was that we transact every day in the United States currency, right? That's our inherent bias, right? If we were in another country, that wouldn't be, you would have a different perspective, right? So changing people's perspective and helping them identify, oh, well, this is my bias, because your bias allows you not to see opportunity because you just take something as a given. You take money as a given. People right now not adopting Bitcoin take money as a given. Like it's the United States dollar. There's nothing that's ever going to come supplant the US dollar. Like a non-Bitcoiner, if you told them that, you know, hey, there's this book called the Bitcoin Standard, right? Yeah. And they like getting them to read it. Like, what does this future look like? You know, they don't even really understand at this point. I would say the average person, here'd be a thought experiment too. What is the average person, if you asked your friends, I think most people think the dollar is still tied to gold. I think they would think, the average person would probably think that money is backed by something. I would think that's a consensus opinion.
It's definitely not zero.
It's definitely not zero, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
I think it's more than you'd like it.
Right. So I think if you went to on college campus, right, and you asked the average person what's backed, if you phrased it like this, you'd almost be setting them up. What backs the U.S. dollar? I think 90% way more than 50% are going to say gold. Way more. I don't think the 20, okay, now, here it is, 29.3% of Americans believe the U.S. dollar is backed by gold. That's of all Americans. I think if you took young people, I think it's way north of, I mean, when you say the average, does that say average 29 point? No, it just says 29% of Americans believe when they polled that.
I don't think it would be that high, but I still believe it's there.
I think it would be north of 50%. So my point being with that is that there's this confidence backed by some form of history that still lags over. And maybe even if they understand that it's not backed by gold, they think it's backed by something, right? That if you told them it's backed by the military, I think they think you have a tinfoil hat on at that point in time, right? If
Here's something that's interesting. 4.1% of Americans believe the U.S. dollar is backed by oil.
Nice. There you go. So if you add all the things that they think, right, that the dollar is backed by oil, gold, I don't know, tech stocks. I'm sure there's a lot of weird opinions out there on like what it is. I just not teaching people about money and what it is, right, in school has this really bad effect that when they come out and they work for it, they don't actually understand what they're working for.
Yeah.
Right? What they're working for. So just kind of as a foundational thing, next week, I think we explore maybe some of those topics of money, history of money.
Everyone's idea.
Yeah.
Their own ideas.
Right. Okay.
Sounds well, we hope good. To see y'all next week or next video.
Yeah. I think we might squeeze one out before next week.
That's true.
Okay. All right. We'll catch you next time.